History as a discipline is something that we look into, and it really gives us a sense of what we're doing in terms of the sweeps of human experience, and it also gives us a real sense of how we should understand Scripture, because we get an experience of where people were at a particular time in history, what Israel was experiencing, and how they were responding to it in their response with God. Now, the very first English history is, of course, Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the Church and People of England. It's the first English understanding of history as a discipline. One of the great histories that's been written in recent times is Diarmaid MacCullogh's History of Christianity. It's called Christianity the First 3,000 Years. Now, of course, that doesn't make sense at first. Christianity is only 2,000 years old. But what he does is he immerses himself in both the Greek culture that philosophically underpins the Christian church, and in, of course, Judaism, our spiritual underpinning. And it's a real understanding of both history, mixing with theology, and the experience of people through the centuries. There are all sorts of great resources that we can read to expand our knowledge of history. And in that expanding of our knowledge of history, it's also important to go back to primary source documents. Now, we all know the Chinese rumor that we were taught as a child, where we whisper something around a circle, and we really do, when we whisper it, have a completely different message at the end. That's why primary source documents are always so important in history. The best source of primary source documents that we can easily access is a small Oxford book by Bettenson. Bettenson is the general editor. It's called Documents of the Christian Church. In that book, there's a whole series of primary source documents, letters from people, studies that were decreed by an emperor to find out what Christianity was about. You get to read all sorts of interesting interpretation. One of the early emperors during the persecutions sees Christians as cannibals from report, because we eat body and blood in our rituals. But you can also see later documents when people start to understand more about what we're about, and you can see the transition, that great transition that happens as we move into a relationship with the state, with Constantine and his experience of Christianity, and of course, Constantine's becoming a Christian. That moves us into a period of history in Europe that's really considered Christendom, where the state and the church are in a balance. Constantine, of course, even founds a new Christian Rome, specifically a Christian city, the city of Constantinople. And his desire is to establish a new Christian empire centered on this new city, taking the best of the past, but bathing the city in a Christian understanding of the world. That city will survive, and survives today, of course, as Constantinople or Istanbul in Turkey. In our understanding of history, too, we as Anglicans have to especially look at England and the English experience of Christianity. You'll notice as you begin your studies in history that there's two strains, a Celtic strain and a Roman strain. Earlier missionaries preserving some of the Christian past that's largely lost when the Roman Empire starts to pull out of England. But you'll also see a situation where people start to send missionaries from Rome, starting with, of course, Augustine of Canterbury, the first Archbishop of Canterbury. And in that study, you'll see a struggle to form a Christianity that's a balance between the Celtic nature of the country and the Western understanding that's coming from Europe. Later in history, of course, we see what really gives birth to Anglicanism, and that centers, of course, on the Tudors and that period of history. When you look at it, you'll discover that England has come out of what literally is 100 years of civil war in the Wars of the Roses. Henry VII is the end of those civil wars as the Lancaster and the York houses are united. Henry VIII, his son, is absolutely desperate to preserve the country. and to keep from falling back into a civil war over who will rule. So he becomes desperate to have children and to establish his regime. The famous 6 wives of Henry VIII are, of course, all about having children. But Henry leaves only 3 surviving children. His young son Edward, who establishes what we think of as a truly independent Anglican church. Now, Henry makes a break with Rome, but he doesn't let anything change. It's really the same church, but with a break. Edward is the beginning of the Reforms, and that's where Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, starts to have an effect on the country and its belief and its way of operation. He desires that the whole country will learn to bathe itself in love, that our love needs to be touched by the love of God and create a community that's founded and rooted in love. And reading his primary source documents, you see that that's constantly being mentioned. When young Edward dies, his sister, Mary I, Bloody Mary, comes to the throne, and England is almost back to a struggle that could lead to a civil war. When that finishes, Elizabeth I is left to try and pull things together, and she establishes the Via Media, the Anglican way that we know. She establishes a compromise between the extremes of continental Protestantism and Catholicism and establishes the balance that we're so used to. In 1944, a bishop, who was the bishop of the Diocese of Hong Kong and Macau, was faced with a situation during the Second World War. He was informed that all British nationals and all Chinese who were Anglicans, because they were suspect of being pro-British, would be interred for the rest of the war. He was also informed they would be in separate prisoner camps, and one of them for women, one of them for men, and there would be no communication between the two. The bishop suddenly discovered the women from his diocese would have no clergy for the rest of the war, and no clergy would be allowed to visit. So he ordained a woman. That's how the first woman was ordained in our church. Out of necessity, a bishop acting as a renegade. But that particular woman, if you go to London, you'll see her picture in St. Martin's in the Fields. There are 2 Chinese-speaking congregations that meet under that roof. They're larger than the English-speaking congregations, and she was the clergy person who started that ministry. Later, she spent time in Canada and died in Toronto in her 80s. So you'll see her picture, if you just look to the side of the altar at St. Martin's in the Fields in Trafalgar Square. All sorts of neat little bits of history, some in living memory and some from the distant past, but they're all part of our shared experience of God in our lives. So, as we spend our time in history, there's all sorts of wonderful resources. The classic for English church history is J.R.H. Mormon's History of the Church of England. The Boy King, Edward VI, and the Protestant Reformation. A good understanding of what was going on at the time when Cranmer is producing the very first English worship services. And this particular biography is one of the great biographies of Cranmer, with a real understanding of what his theology was and the struggles that he was going through. Cranmer, of course, is one of the 3 blind mice of the children's rhyme as well. And that's about Mary removing their bishoprics before their executions. God's Secretaries, the making of the King James Bible. It's always amusing to me that some people put great store in the King James Bible and the authority of the King James Bible, who would never put much authority in the Anglican Church, since it's really a creation of the Anglican Church. It's an attempt at an authorized and simplified and readable translation of the Bible. Now, one of the realities of the King James Bible is that it uses 7,000 words. That's it. Shakespeare's The Tempest uses 100,000 words. So it really was a simple translation in its day. Now, unfortunately, a modern simple translation aimed at someone who has, grade 12 needs to have 1,000 words. So it's a great shift in terms of our literary ability in the last few centuries. But the King James Bible and its eloquence, mixed with the Book of Common Prayer, have been the two single things that have been most influential on forming the English language as we know it today. The First Bishop, which is a Nova Scotia book, Cuthbertson, and it's about the first Bishop of Nova Scotia, Charles Inglis. I know this is a monster general overview, but it's the Oxford Illustrated History of Christianity, a good summary of everything and a good resource for looking up some of the details of history and getting a sense of what's happened through the centuries.